Yeah, so hi everybody. I'm with Alex Ebert here. Um, Today we're going to sort of talk about the discrepancy between lack and the gap. Um, Now, Ebert, I know you messaged me wanting to talk about this, um, but I started thinking more about the sort of the arguments, the line of thoughts that have been sort of circulating around this topic. Because I recently watched a video of Bard. I think it was like maybe a year ago now.
Mm-hmm.
He was talking about the VPA, virtual potential actual kind of thing, and possibilities and potential.
Yeah.
So I realized that I think the discrepancy is going to be talking about the infinite. And I'm assuming is the infinite what you call indeterminacy.
Yeah, we kind of use enormity just to stay away because so infinity almost applies like sort of a an ontic state or an objective sort of state, whereas enormity is sort of like scale dependent, right? And would depend on the observer's capacity to calculate. So enormity is all that really matters to produce the phenomenology of an infinity. So including phenomenology, we're including the calculative capacity of whichever subject we're referring to. So enormity would be the proper way to keep the subject in the conversation of infinity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So my question is, it's like I know Bard has a sort of like materialism. I'm assuming you have the same. I don't know how close and how distant you are between Bard in terms of like the way he thinks and the way you diverge. Um,
I don't either. I know that I agree with a lot of. I like VPA.
okay.
Over the years, we've come closer and closer. As you may recall, like we started off uh, very much against one another, as far as I can tell. And I'd be happy to debate Bart on this by just going through our history together. He has basically come all the way over to me, not vice versa. And the way in which he's come over to me, I think, symbolizes the discretion between, or the discrepancy between what you had posted about lack and what Lacan generally would call lack as the constitutive feature of the subject, um, versus the function of, well, first of all, limits, boundaries, and then implied in the acquisition of interiority, something like saturation and excess, and how there is a, once you introduce phenomenology, there's a phenomenological valence that we put on saturation, which generally has the valence of lack. But lack is not fundamentally the ontic quality of that interiority. Rather, the ontic quality of that interiority is saturation, is excess. So that's really the thing I'm always trying to remind people of. And that was a discrepancy between us and seems to no longer be.
Okay. So the question for me would be, do you accept, is proportionality for you a valence?
What do you mean by that? Proportionality?
So, for example, like, like a nerve, like to increase nerve conduction, you would need to have the increasing of the diameter of that nerve. So it's proportionate to each other, essentially, right? You increase the diameter of the nerve, you increase the conduction of that nerve.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay. Because it may be like for me, Like, so you are saying proportionality is a valence?
No.
Okay.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think valence, just the way that I'm using valence,
Yeah.
so proportionality would be ambivalent, and we would be talking about the extent to which, a valence to me is good or bad. It's sort of like applying a binary, usually a phenomenological binary, to an event, like yes, no, good, bad, dark, light, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So it depends on, is the signal coming through one of pleasure, one of pain? These would be valences.
Okay. But it's fundamentally ambivalent, right?
I think it is ambivalent. I also think, by the way, when we get to proportionality, there's always a limit or a threshold beyond which, for instance, let's say we experience pleasure up to a given threshold. Beyond that threshold, we enter a state of indeterminacy where we can no longer determine. Well, two things could happen, where the pleasure switches valence and becomes pain,
Mhm.
or vice versa, or where there is so much pleasure that one can no longer tell if any more pleasure has been added, sort of like an extra drop of water in the ocean. So,
Mhm.
there is a sort of limit structure to proportionality that can sort of immobilize the ability, phenomenological ability to apply an additional valence. Yeah.
Okay. So the next question I have for you is saturation kind of like your Hegelian form of like sublimation in a kind of
Uh, Sublation, yeah, it is the interior state of the sublated event.
okay. So are you still using like the kind of general like the Hegelian idea of just like it's something that's preserved and then sort of like exceeded, going beyond its sort of limits at the same time, holding this kind of like simultaneity of it, the preservation and also going beyond itself.
Yeah, the going beyond itself. So it is like when I think about cognitive dynamics, and I think about the knowledge acquisition, epistemic acquisition, the way that and this is what I'm sort of writing a paper on now. So for instance, in experience, we have these, let's just say and I'll probably use these two words a lot: problematicity and automaticity. But basically, problematicity is just my word for when you encounter an error, something that hasn't been accommodated into the schema of the brain. You're like, oh, what is that? Okay, there's sort of an error has been triggered. And your brain tarries with it to a certain extent, and you have these neuronal firings and couplings that occur. And if they don't exceed a certain threshold, your brain just sort of is like, okay, well, it didn't saturate, it didn't exceed the error threshold, the precision weighting, for me to need to take that into consideration as a genuine error. I don't need to change the map to fit the territory. It wasn't strong enough of an error. But if an error occurs beyond a given threshold, it literally will create a saturation event in the brain, and trigger something called hysteresis, which basically is the production of basically a cognitive topology that does exhibit hysteresis, which is the preservation of basically a sublated event, the preservation of a saturation beyond the conditions which precipitated it. So for instance, if the conditions that precipitate a saturation in the brain are, you know, XYZ, and then XYZ dissipate, that concentrated neural event will actually sustain itself beyond the point at which the conditions which brought it about dissipate. And that's called hysteresis. And there's a claim to be made that that functions as a kind of topological memoric or memory node that exists beyond the event. Anyway, to bring that into just basic metaphysical language, I do think that every sublation, just speaking really basic and fundamental terms, every sublation is likely preserved in some sense. I mean, the easiest way to describe this, I think, is in terms of systems and nested systems. So if we have the concentration and saturation of one boundary, that boundary now is a subject. It's no longer a system comprised of a bunch of little sub-subjects, but now it has saturated into its own subject. And now it exists in a larger constellation, if you will, of other saturated subjects. And then through interaction, those comprise the relata of a new system, a larger system. And through interaction, those degrees of freedom will close and a new saturated subject will produce, all of which contain the nested sublations of prior sublated states. And so in that sense, in that very simplified sense, if we simply think of scale, and yes, they persist as saturations. The extent to which they ascend is not contained in the sublated state in any real sense. To me, that alpha bang sort of like it's destroyed and ascends and da-da-da-da is sort of more metaphorical. The ascension begins at the moment of sublation because suddenly you're now been integrated and introduced to a new constellation of subjects, and you are relating newly with other subjects and creating a new sublation. So a very concrete example is you have a person, and then you have another person, and then you have another person and another person, and you have some boundary zone. Let's say it's demarcated by a valley with water. And you guys are all living together as a tribe. You have more people. Pretty soon, yes, you have the tribe, then you have sort of like, you know, the town and then the nation state and so on and so forth, until you have sort of the global village, just as a really bad example. But that would all occur through saturated interactions and sublated states. So that is the sort of ascending of the sublation. But in and of itself, as we are as individuals, there is no ascension per se beyond the sublated state, except through and vis-a-vis our interaction now with other sublated subjects. Sorry for the long-winded description, but it's a very, I can see you're asking me questions and leading me down to then, you know, like problematize it. So I want to be as clear as I can.
Well, I mean, so if you accept, you know, proportionality, you know, to an extent, you also accept like memory plays a certain role in your system. Is that still correct? Right?
Yeah.
So like how does a sublated quantity or persist? It would have to be related to memory, I'm assuming. Is that how you would think about it?
Well, memory is really interesting, you know, the extent to which like these sublated acquisitions, like for instance, if I, you know, acquire sunglasses and I have that as a sort of automatic object, which I would call a sub-object. It's no longer an object, it's now a sub-object. I interact with it automatically. The extent to which it is problematized and produces an error is the extent to which it is temporarily removed from a subject back into an object. I have to then reassimilate or even accommodate it if I come across a very strange pair of glasses. But once it is accommodated into the state of automaticity, it has effectively disappeared, and it is isomorphic to the real. This is the part I think that, I'm jumping ahead here, but once something is in a state of automaticity, we produce as subjects the real through knowledge acquisition. So through determinate knowledge acquisition, oh, I see, these are glasses. Once glasses is automatic, it's no longer a determinate object insofar as the way that my subconscious now interacts with it. I no longer need my consciousness to interact with glasses. It's now subconscious. And so it basically integrates into a state isomorphic to the real. So subjects as saturated beings, and we're constantly as subjects oscillating between problematicity, automaticity. The extent to which that is memoric is, I think memory is a very packed term, and I would hesitate to say that I remember sunglasses. I would say, interestingly, that it's more that once the sublated sub-object of sunglasses integrates from explosive synchronization, which is the moment of sublation in which I finally accommodate this, it graduates into classical synchronization, in which it's just in a kind of constant constellation of relations. So it's not that I remember sunglasses in particular, but in relation to other vectors of sub-objects, I remember what sunglasses are. So in some ways, the only time I really remember sunglasses is when an error is produced such that my consciousness has to come forward and recall what sunglasses are, to integrate them, like to forget them. As I like to say, thought converges on thoughtlessness, which is a clunky way of saying it, but I don't particularly remember sunglasses as a working function of my day. It's just part of a working constellation of a classical synchronization and the basic vector relationship between sub-objects.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're basically giving a very similar account of like Heidegger's you don't pay attention to the hammer until it breaks kind of thing.
Yeah.
I guess the question I have for you is, so obviously in this case, you wouldn't be saying that we control memory, right? That we can just pull memory. Because for example, how would you explain the moments where I'm washing the dishes and then memories of my father emerge, right? How do you explain those types of moments?
I don't know, that's not something I've given. Involuntary sort of memory recall is not something I've given a whole lot of thought to. I'd be happy to talk about it here with you, but I'm definitely curious which path you're leading me down, and I don't want to be too careful. I don't have an answer for you with regard to that, because I haven't thought enough about that.
Well, I mean, it's not that I'm it's not like I'm trying to trap you or something, but it is an important problem for me when thinking about memory, how memory recall sort of just emerges. And for me, this is where I feel like lack is become something more than just a epistemological kind of valence. Because it's sort of for me, it's sort of frames for this possible emergence to happen. Where it's because it's almost like explaining how do you explain, it's almost like trying to explain how does Freudian association even happen, right? Because it's even within the very presence that I'm in, with all the objects I'm surrounded in, right? Computer, laptop, book, everything. For some reason, something non-linear gets triggered, non-present gets triggered, in which now I'm like thrown into a memory of like, you know, my father talking to me when I was a kid, you know, or telling me something, right? So it's a very interesting thing to explain about sort of how that just emerges. And that's where kind of like my emphasis on lack seems like important, to kind of just explain this like emergence. Um, it gets difficult for me to think through your system in terms of how do I explain this emergence through saturation, um, and everything.
Well, how does lack explain the emergence of thinking of your father while doing the dishes to you?
Well, I mean, I look at it like, and this may be a poor explanation, but like, because lack has, you know, this agreed upon just broad definition of like presence and absence, right? At least that's how I kind of define it, as like this presence and absence kind of thing, right? So when it comes to memory recall, there is something to explain, like in relation to the unconscious, or you know, you call it the subconscious, that there is something. It's to me it's the interaction with the oscillation of the presence and the absence, right? So in my automaticity, something is absent, and yet at the same time, in the very presence within the relations that I'm interacting with, right, whether it be the dishes or something like that, this very relation, like for me, the lack is the relation between these things, this very relation between absence and presence. And so to explain this kind of like emergence of just a memory is, to me, simply this, basically how a memory event can happen. How can it happen? It's simply the collision of this absence and presence sort of relating to each other in a very specific way. And that's why I think about proportionality, because for some reason, it has to relate in a very specific way, because association isn't just relating blindly. It's a kind of nonlinear relation in which there is a kind of ordering to it, right? You start thinking about a bottle, and then all of a sudden it starts triggering lines of thought that are unrelated to the bottle, that triggers memories from there. So that's, yeah, I mean, hopefully that kind of.
Well, so let's just unpack presence versus absence for a second.
Okay.
So presence, obviously you can be in the presence of something, let's say money, and realize how little you have, right? Presence and absence aren't antonyms necessarily. And in fact, in my metaphysics, presence and absence are two sides of the exact same coin. Once you end up with the only way to put a valence on something, first of all, that something has to be phenomenologically present, first of all, but it has to be phenomenologically present. Let's differentiate between two things now, additionally, absence and lack. So presence versus absence is neither have anything to do with lack in my metaphysics. In my metaphysics, presence and absence are two sides of the same coin. In order to perceive absence, you must have sufficient presence such that it overwhelms your ability to determinate. So the only way I may phenomenologically experience, the old trick, like, don't think of a bear hiding behind a tree.
Mhm.
And then, like, you can't not think of a bear hiding behind a tree.
Right.
Well, there is no bear behind any tree. Nevertheless, the bear behind the tree is present. It's not absent. He's now present. Phenomenologically speaking, he's present. How would you get rid of the bear behind the tree?
You have to think of something else, I'm assuming.
No. Well, yeah, sure, but like, classically, like, one of the things they've discovered with what do they call it? Cognitive behavior, CBD, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, I suppose, is that it doesn't work for OCD patients. OCD patients are constantly locked into a repetition automatism, right? They're constantly locked into their symptom, to the point of, like, symptomal engagement. I mean, it's like, it really is who they are. And that's also why, like 90% of the people who are prescribed prescriptions for schizophrenia self-voluntarily stop taking them, because they're like, you know what? I liked it the other way, because it's symptomic. It is the basis of your centrality to the universe. And in OCD, there is a compulsion simply to think. Yes, it might be of the same thing, but then it's another thing. Okay, so I replaced the bear behind the woods with something else that now I'm fixated on is driving me crazy. I'm just in a state of constant thought. Now, OCD, like the most recent advances in OCD have been like, okay, you know what? CBT doesn't work, because CBT is about thinking about something else or thinking your way out of it. But then you can think your way out of, then thinking your way out of it becomes your obsession. And and now all you can do is think your way out of it, think your way out of it, think your way out of it. And that itself is the object of compulsion. Anyway, my point is, the other way to get rid of the bear behind the tree is to multiply the bear behind the tree to such an extent that you can no longer tell everything is the bear behind the tree. Everything I look at, everything I see, you push it to excess. And at that point of excess, the vectors of relationship between each instantiation of the bear behind the tree collapse. And you can no longer tell one bear behind the tree from another bear behind the tree. It's all the same thing. It's similar to doing semantic satiation, which I call semantic saturation, which we've all probably done. You repeat the same thing over and over and over and over and over. Bear behind the tree, bear behind the tree, bear behind the tree, bear behind the tree, bear behind the tree. And pretty soon, and this is the way mantras work, it graduates from determinate form to indeterminate form. Suddenly, you don't know what bear behind the tree even means anymore. And that's how a mantra works. A mantra doesn't work just the first time you say it. A mantra works through repetition, because there's something about repeating a determinate that graduates itself beyond a certain threshold into indeterminacy. And that indeterminacy is the absence generated through an excess of presence. And that is how we get generally to experience. And I would say, like, if people don't like experience because it implies objecthood, you can say imperience. But to imperience, if you will, indeterminacy. And that is absence. It is a plenum. And it is an ambivalent plenum. It's not lack. It's not presence. It's not absence. It's presence as absence. It is excess as absence. And then we phenomenologically cannot grab a determinate, and therefore we generally apply the valence of lack. But we don't have to. It is ambivalent as a structure, as a topological structure. It's ambivalent. But we usually, especially in the West, apply a negativity, apply lack. Now, in the East, they might be laughing at this conversation and be like, what do you mean? That's a plenum. That's everything. That's the everythingness of nothing. And Hegel would use that phrase, the nothingness of everything. Anyway, so my point on like the constitutive lack and to try and bring this back to the father, what I would say is you're washing dishes. You're classically, like they say, and I've been washing a lot of dishes as of late. It's supposed to be the best way to wash dishes is as a kind of meditation.
Yeah.
And so you're washing dishes and you're in a state of automaticity. You've done this many, many times. You're in your own the real, or at least something isomorphic to the real. It is an indeterminate state. And you're just washing dishes. Now, you may know this is a dish, this is water. All of those things are determinate, and they're all within the symbolic. But what Lacan doesn't understand, and what Zizek doesn't understand, is that once those aggregate in sufficiency, that they graduate to automaticity, they are isomorphic to the real. So the idea that we never experience the real, or we're never within the real, and we're always circling the real as petit object is completely inverted. We are, the lack that we feel is when we become aware of the automatism. And suddenly we're like, I have nothing, I am nothing. You put a valence on that indeterminate state, you realize you're bored. Boredom is one of the greatest functions toward productivity that we have, is when you realize and you suddenly get a valence on the automaticity. Now, with regard to your dad, now I don't know if your dad is alive or dead or whatever the case, but let's just use something easier, because that's so emotionally charged, your father, but we can come back to it. You see a bird across the window. How did you think of the bird? Well, it's because the bird interrupted the automatic state and was produced an error, right? And so your brain sort of suddenly tracked it, and you went from subconscious to conscious. By the way, just momentarily, and by the way, I wanted to make a distinction. I don't call the unconscious subconscious. So there's just three registers. There's the unconscious, subconscious, and conscious.
Okay.
And they vaguely relate, by the way, to Bard's VPA, but we can talk about that later. But anyway, with regard to, so that's how a thought occurs in the middle of an automaticity. Now, how a thought occurs that isn't physically present, and how it just might arise, that's a wonderful question. I wonder that all the time, like how come an idea suddenly strikes me, whatever the case. When Lacan says the unconscious is structured like a language and it has sort of like this semantic or syntactical form, there's another guy, Elon Berhaltz, who just came, I think I'm pronouncing his last name somewhat correctly. He just came out, you may have seen it, that language is an autonomous system running in us. It is basically a virus, but it just goes on and on. And by the way, this new therapy, the name, it's called ACT, but I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But it basically, the premise of it, instead of using CBT to combat OCD and so forth, is you just give up and admit that the brain's job is to think, and it will think no matter what, and you can't stop it from thinking. And so the only job is to then, of course, be the witness. But anyway, the idea being that I find it fascinating too. You're doing nothing, and then all of a sudden some idea comes up and you don't really know where it came up from. And that may be because the brain is just always thinking. And it may produce its own states of problematicity with or without your impetus. The idea of the father is obviously interesting and a great example of like a Lacanian concept, and related to the real. Like, how is it that the name of the father, or that which should not be named, that which should operate as a suppression, would come up? on its own. And the Lacan, I believe, would say the very fact that those things come up without our you know, are effectively due to our suppression. It's almost like, you know, everything has an equilibrium. You try and submerge a bubble here, it has to pop up over there. So anyway, long-winded way of saying it's a great question. I'm not sure that the framing of our particular argument with lack answers it, but I'm curious as to know why you think that somehow lack is involved in that.
Well, I mean, it definitely relates to beauty for me. Because when you try to, and this is like borrowing from like Luber and Jock in here, where it's like, you know, Luber always asks this question of like, so how do we make sense of inspiration, right? How do we make sense of an inspiration that sort of emerges as this kind of like motivation? But it's a little bit different from a motivation, right? Because it's like, it's sort of like this inspiration definitely has this sense of like, it's something other than me that is provoking me into this certain direction, right? This sort of change of direction, this directionality change that emerges, right? For me, I need to address your thing about the real. So I do agree that you can encounter the real. I don't believe it was my understanding that Supanchik or Lacan was never saying that you cannot encounter the real, unless I misunderstood you. But
let me, yeah, if I could jump in.
Yeah, go ahead.
You can encounter it, but it's not schematizable. It's not, it resists signification.
Okay.
Symbolization. But I guess my point was that through integrating symbolization, you produce something that is isomorphic to the real. So for instance, any object that you relate with completely automatically is a saturated object, topologically isomorphic to the real. You cannot access the interiority of that object any more than you can access the real. So we are comprised and composed of the real. Now, it's a split subject-esque, but where the entire subject is that, is comprised of that sort of an oscillation between that state of the real and something more determinate.
Okay. I think I get what you're saying. So you're saying like the traditional kind of Lacanian approach to the real is that it can't be symbolized, but you're saying through this kind of interior saturation, actually you do kind of relate to the real in such a way that actually it is possible to basically produce the real.
Yeah, I would say, to try and put it even more simply, every single epistemic acquisition is a mini production of the real vis-a-vis its consolidation, the informational consolidation, the relational consolidation that comprises each and every epistemic acquisition has an interiority which is isomorphic to the real.
Okay, so let me just repeat this back to you. So basically what you're saying is that the real is essentially the saturated thing that you already did, like to some degree.
Or that you haven't yet done.
Okay. Because it's that does add like a twist to the Lacanian understanding that to some degree it's already something that's been incorporated into automaticity and yet to be incorporated into automaticity.
Yes. And by the way, one of the interesting things is anything you incorporate into automaticity has so many oblique affordances. Like it could be whatever, a tree, and you understand the affordances of tree in an automatic sense where you never encounter error as shade, food, a playing gym, a meeting grounds, a watering hole. Let's even say you're as advanced as you'd say firewood. And those are the affordances, and you know that, and that's it, and you interact completely automatically. Its internal topology is saturated. It's inert. You interact with it so much, you have that much relation to it that you never encounter error. But then one day, and this is that moment in 2001, right, where suddenly the monkey man is like, oh, the bone isn't just a bone. There's an oblique affordance that I just discovered. And what's interesting about each one of these objects, and I think this is part of the synthomic sort of like jouissance of like encountering a single object over and over again, is that every object has an enormity of affordance structures that are oblique to us. So we may have 5 affordances, but each one contains or sort of implies an enormity of oblique affordances that we have not yet considered. For instance, the wood, that, as you said, the Heideggerian hammer, arm of the hammer, the boat, fucking bow and arrow, a house, canoe, whatever the fucking thing is, paper to write on, right? So, and that all those affordances live out there as part of the soup of the real, as Lacan would call it. So yes, there's this exterior, internal, interior sort of like resonance of the real unrealized and the real compressed.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out where I want to go. I have several directions, but I think the first thing to clarify is, what do you mean by gap? And why is that a pivotal distinction for you?
Well, you know, I would love to ask you, because I think if I'm not mistaken, you like gap more than I like gap.
Well, I don't really use gap, honestly.
Okay.
I don't really use gap, no.
Okay, I don't use gap much either, and I think gap is a bit of a hack.
Okay.
I think that gap, the way in which I use gap almost exclusively is in the sort of Eisensteinian theory of montage back in the fucking whatever late teens, 20s, which is brilliant, but it is vectoral. It's simply vectoral. Like phenomenological gap is vectoral relational gap. It is, I'll try to find an interesting one here. It is an empty bottle and a hat. There is a gap between these objects that I have not previously assimilated and automatized, right? So I am now thrown from subconsciousness into consciousness, into problem solving, and I have to figure out if I'm going to accommodate this, if I'm going to let this live as sort of like, you know, a problematic object, which we might call art, and so on and so forth. And that is how basically we storytell. When we're talking about memory, you know, gap is the participatory invitation between objects. And back to the Eisenstein thing, let's just say, image of a man looking like this. You have the shadow, the image of a bird, and then you go back to the man and he's smiling. 3 completely distinct states, but the mind tells the story. It fills in the gap. The man saw the bird and the man became happy. That's how I use gap. I just use it sort of as a narratological, the space in which the subject functions narratologically.
Okay. Because it almost like functions as like a way to surprise.
It requires, I would say, to experience it requires surprise. It does get automatized. Those gaps get automatized. The extent to which we would say, are they still gaps then? I think there are still gaps vectorally functioning in the sort of the classical synchronization regime of the brain. we would still say that there is a gap between honey and jam and toast. It's just that that gap has been automatized. If there were no gap, ontologically speaking, between honey and jam and toast, and the subject, for instance, and we could do this ourselves, decided to say, to glom the three together, quite literally in a concoction, or verbally and semantically, they would cease to exist as discrete objects, and they would combine. So the gap is still there functionally, even if I'm in a state of automaticity. But interestingly, like, you know, I would say we can define art, or at least poetry, let's say, by that art form which makes us aware of the gap such that we become conscious of the gap and the bridging process between gaps. I mean, that's why poetry is like really an art form, and great cinema. Like, speaking of 2001, like I just showed that to my 13-year-old daughter, and there are a lot of gaps, that poetic gaps, I guess we could call them, which make us aware of the imperative of bridging the gaps. And yeah, but those gaps do function automatically. So I wouldn't say that knowledge acquisition into automaticity is the erasure of the gaps, but this sort of the opening of the the smoothing of the pavement, so to speak.
Do you still look at gaps as epistemological then?
Yeah.
Okay. 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 All right. So this is where it gets interesting, because it feels like it takes me back to an argument I had with Daniel Garner like years ago.
Can I clarify one thing? That was a great question.
Uh-huh.
Gaps are epistemological. The vectors that those gaps represent, I would say, is something more like ontological. The vector space.
The vector space.
Yeah, like if you were to take all the gaps and all between all the objects and sort of map them vectorally, like relationship, like a map of relata per se.
Yeah.
That would start to look more like ontology.
Okay. 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 Yeah, so I mean, just some like history on the lack thing. I mean, sort of the way we approach it is kind of like going back to this argument of something or nothing, right? Just the traditional metaphysical argument of why something over nothing. And it's to simply say that the nothing was always a false kind of like proposition, like false category anyways. And that there's sort of like dangers in sort of reducing lack to nothing, essentially. And so, and this, I think you basically did address this, but like just to kind of reiterate my, the space is like to reduce, like I feel like when I hear lack is epistemological, it sort of reduces it to nothing again.
Well, I said the gap is epistemological, not the lack.
Okay.
I would honestly say that the lack is phenomenological.
Okay. Okay. But it's still a valence.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, so this really takes me back to an argument I had probably like, I don't know, maybe like 3 years ago with Daniel with lack and excess, because I originally, this you'll find funny, I originally was on the side of excess, actually. Actually, funny enough, I was actually on the side of excess, right? And so what gets, like, to me, what's like honestly very just like flat out arbitrary is the distinction between excess and lack, right? Because, you know, the way Daniel was explaining to me is like, well, there's like lack can be excessive, right? Sort of to play on those kind of words, like lack can be excessive. And so, and it's still, again, it's still arbitrary, even the use of lack. But at the end of the day, I still feel, I guess my position is more like, if we're talking about magnitude, and this is the question that kind of emerges, which is, to me, it's arbitrarily positioned in such a way as to where I am not really sure that I can confidently say that the cut is in the subject, or that the cut in the subject also indicates the cut in the excess.
Okay. Can we just, I realize I haven't asked you a question.
Yeah.
What are you most interested in? Are you, or what do you even call yourself? I'm sure you wouldn't like nail yourself to one cross or the other, but are you like interested in structuralism? Are you interested in metaphysics? Or are you interested in sort of just something in between, like the human, like psychoanalysis? Because sometimes I can't tell. Sometimes I think we may be talking past each other just because we're using the exact same terms, and they mean really, in some ways, almost the same things, but they're talking at different registers, so they can actually talk past each other.
So funny enough, like, I think probably Luber's probably more in the interest of metaphysics than I am, actually. Metaphysics and ontology. I actually do a lot of my work on ethics.
Okay.
And so that's where a lot of like my thinking goes on ethics. So again, for example, like I like to use Aristotle's, which is always poorly kind of used as a kind of like this middle path kind of way that people think, the middle path to discovering what the right thing to do is within a situation. Like I look at that as a sort of the missing element in which there's a lack. Like actually virtue is very much about lack, because it's none of the given anything that is presented. So anything that is presented within a situation, an ethical situation, in order to be virtuous, is actually not present. And it wouldn't be something as simple as saying, oh, well, we just have to find the missing information. The missing information is actually not fully relevant to the conversation. Actually, what would be missing would be, how do you relate to your specific condition, your predisposition in relation to the situation? And that sort of draws, this is sort of, again, it's related back to proportion, which is my disposition in relation to the situation. And then there's a third with that gap, is precisely the virtuous position, which is how do I relate to myself within this situation, and then the missing space in which to act and sort of behave. And Aristotle admits, like, it's not a given, because between excess and insufficiency are basically only the parameters that we can understand. So for example, like if I say something like for example, with anger's a good example of this. If you've never been angry before, Aristotle might say, and this is where you might agree, it's probably better to be excessively angry, because at the very least you get a sort of feel for the accommodation of how angry should I be? How angry can I be? Right? I don't understand anger. This is where you're right? Where it's like epistemological. I don't understand anger, so I need to try to be angry to actually get like I'll use like a layman's term, but like a vibe for it, right? But then where the virtue comes in is, well, now that you've experienced the sort of excess of the anger, right? Because insufficiency of anger in that moment won't give you enough information to actually feel out the emotion, right? You actually always be a child in relation to your emotions, precisely because anger isn't something that you're actually accustomed to. It's not automatic. In fact, you're just always repressing your anger. And so you actually lack the skills to actually navigate that space. What I'm trying to say is that once you play with an excess of anger, you actually develop the skills to navigate the proper setting for the situation in which anger could unfold in a sort of appropriate way. Right. So that's how I kind of think about lack in relation to virtue, because it makes a lot of sense to me when even learning to speak, you might as well speak as much as you can, so that way actually you learn the moments when you shouldn't speak, when you actually should refrain from speaking.
But where is the sense? Where is lack? And is lack for you? Are you referring to like a phenomenological lack, or what kind of lack are you? Where's the lack in there?
I mean, this is the part that I don't really
like. For instance, you had a lack of, you lack the skills to be able to do something, but you're sort of making a determination on a third party. Like, how is that subject experiencing lack, and when do they experience lack?
So see, that's the that's the other interesting question, right? Because this is where I have a problem with something like the good comes in. Because the good, basically what I call the symbolic order, is going to tell you, well, there's right ways to behave and right ways to act, right? But for me, in some ways, that lack is kind of like outside of the symbolic order.
But when you say that lack, you just, what did you mean just now? Like, what lack? I'm missing where you're getting your lack.
Yeah, and that's hard to explain, because like I still look at it as like an absent presence kind of thing. Which you say they're not, they're not contraries to each other. But for me, they are contraries, because how, and I guess I'll say phenomenologically speaking, when the subject is trying to figure out what to do, they are only playing with the present things that have already been symbolized in trying to respond to the situation.
But let me say it a different way. I have some problem. I don't know how to solve it. So we would say, okay, typically that's a lack, right? I lack the tools to solve it.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just keep it completely conceptual. Like, I have this problem, and I'm thinking of all the ways I can solve it, and none of them solve it. But these are the only, let's just say I have access to all the things I can think that I already know. My entire epistemological frame I'm bringing to bear on this problem, and I can't figure it out. I either lack some epistemological object, or I lack some combination between these objects which would produce the solution.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, I lack something that I don't have. The integration of which would produce a completion. So at an even more basic level, what I'm saying is we oscillate as subjects between lack and completion and lack and completion. And what I'm saying is there is a relationship between completion and lack, where the very completion of something and it receding into automaticity produces the sensation or the phenomenology or even the ontology of lack, or it makes the valence of lack available to us by completing the solution. So I guess what I'm saying is this idea of the thing never being solvable, Well,
Uh-huh.
it's not true because epistemological sort of acquisition is constant completion and recompletion and recompletion, and it's baked in repetition, automatism. The very idea of repetition doesn't imply circling a thing. It implies getting the thing and then doing the thing over and over and over again. And why would we do that thing over and over again? And I guess what I feel is missing here
Yeah.
is the aspect which oscillates between lack and the absence of lack, which absence gives us cause to put a valence on it as lack again. Thus, lack is not a constant experience, but rather an oscillating experience that is produced by the very completion that lack precipitates. So when we complete, we then end up with an indeterminacy that we can interpret as lack. We're off to the next thing. We complete it. We interpret that as lack, and so on and so forth, precisely because those saturated completions phenomenologically and relationally look like absence. Either because they matriculate into automaticity and become absent from the conscious frame, or because they are topologically absent, relationally absent, because they're so relationally complete. The degrees of freedom have completely closed on a closed topic, a closed object.
Yeah, so you make me think like this lack is essentially the very actually, so because for me, I accept lack as both epistemological and ontological. And like,
I do too.
okay,
But only in the sense that we're putting a valence. I just want to make sure
yeah,
we're putting a valence on either lack at the epistemological or ontological level. If I see that the entire set of relations of a given system have collapsed vis-a-vis saturation, I may say, well, they lack relation because there is zero relation. What is ambivalent of me to say is there are 0 degrees of freedom. There is no more relation. That's ambivalent. But for me to say they lack relation, that's a valence, right? That's me assigning a valence to it. So I'm just making sure, yes, I see it at the ontological level, which is again the general map of vectors. And I could say, yes, that general map of vectors is sublated and therefore lack relation. But that's a valence I'm putting on it as a subject. Ontically, or I would say like ontically, there is no valence on there. And I would even say ontologically, in and of itself, there is no valence of lack. It is simply saturated.
okay. So excess for you, I'm assuming, is ontological, but without a valence.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I guess, I mean, it's like for me, because like I think I've read, like Luber, I think shared with me some of your emails to him. And I know your concern, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. The concern is this kind of experience of incompleteness, right? Like I'm a subject who's always lacking,
Yeah.
this,
That language of incompleteness is
yeah.
so not, I get that it works at the psychoanalytic level and it's sort of like rhetorically spicy and you have to confront it, but it's just metaphysically wrong.
Yeah. I don't disagree with that actual statement that you said, because a lot of what Luber are like, just to give you the cards on the table, Luber, Jockin, and I, and Daniel, even our disagreement with psychoanalysis is that it isn't creative.
Yeah.
So this is where we start using the word positive lack, where lack isn't always something negative. And so for me, it's a way to transform that incompleteness into something productive, right? And so like again, this is where the ambiguity kind of like well, not the ambiguity, but like the kind of like the parallels between us kind of collide, because like you could say, I think, that when we're emphasizing negative and positive lack, that is what you mean by enormity.
It is but it's funny because like yes, it's a positive negative or a positive lack is a way to reconcile with an enormity that would otherwise make you feel absence as a lack, and to positivize that by being like, well, no, it's a positive lack because I know now epistemically that that particular lack is actually an engorgement that thereby disappears itself, and which I previously perceived as lack, and now I see it as a positive lack, and so on. And and so I have no problem with that, but it still sits in the register, even though it's explicitly ambiguous or contrabiguous. It still sits explicitly in the sort of phenomenological correction zone. It doesn't say anything operational about itself, but or specifically metaphysically helpful necessarily, unless we're talking about sort of metaphysics on the level of like religion and ideological explanation, in which case, sure, yeah, it works.
Well, actually, that is kind of my next question, because when you think about your system, does it follow a sort of a given direction of consequences? So, for example, if I were to take your system in a kind of theological sense, am I saying that God doesn't exist? Or am I saying that it leaves room for the possibility that God exists?
Yeah, I don't see how it would have any real bearing on certainly God as a omega point. It implies there is no omega point, except that the omega and alpha are the same point. And each sublation is isomorphic to the other. As I mentioned, the real out there is isomorphic to the real in here. And so in that sense, if God is, in a transcendent and immanent way, but mostly immanent, God as immanence, well, then it would basically be a living proof of God. But it depends, if God is a substance which produces everything on a sort of linear, arrow of time, it would tend to probably throw that into some question.
Okay. I mean, because this is where my honest position is that for me, in order for it to be in like a sort of metaphysical system that is ambiguous, it would have to be fundamentally, on a theological level, end up agnostic.
Agnostic as to whether there is a God?
Yeah. Agnostic in the kind of traditional sense, as we don't really know, right?
Well, what
There
is
could be, it could not.
Again, the definition of God? So you're really referring to a classic creator God then?
No, not even, because the reason I don't even want to give like a formal definition, because I think if I were to play with your system, I would be like, I think most mystics would say, well, that excess is God, right? That excess is God, without really drawing a kind of firm theological definition of like a creator God and causes, etc. I'm I'm not really interested in sort of giving that kind of line of argumentation, but the sort of broad normative example of God is just sort of like this mystery. And so, because like the word God and like how we define it can be all sorts of types of ways, but for me, it's just more like, how can I explain this? It's not about trying to pin down a very specific definition, but it's more about sort of leaving this room of possibility where we could say something like God exists and we could work out the definitions of what that means. But yeah, so for me, the truly metaphysical system has to be sort of agnostic at the end.
Well, I'll say these two things, that the dialectic and definitely freak theory, I think, imply, as far as I can tell, and it very well is cyclical, so that's fine. And so it's like it implies an eschatology, it implies a teleonomy, but it also applies a teleology. You know, it's and it all follows along Freud's death drive, or death drive generally, or drive, however you want to frame it. You know, like Freud's framing, I think, is actually the closest to Hegel's framing, which is that all objects wish to return to inert form. What is it to be inert? It's to have inertia. What is the relation of inertia to time? It is timeless. There is a timelessness. There is a state of eternal mobilization, and yet it's inert. And that is the description of sublation. It is relationally inert through saturation. It is the disappearance of relation through the maximization of relation, through the saturation of relation. And that production is isomorphic. And when I say isomorphic, I mean mathematically equivalent to infinity, period. So whatever we have that we ingest into us as objects, when they sublate through very explicit things like explosive synchronization, and they exceed quantitative thresholds and saturate literally in our brains, they are isomorphic to infinity, just as any complete density is. And again, though, this is scale dependent, right? So they're they're completely isomorphic. They're black boxes to us, just like the LLM black box is a black box, simply because we can't track the amount of calculations and vectorial representations it's doing at any given moment. And we call it a black box. Well, that's because we're not God, and we can't magnify the operations to the extent that our brains can actually track them. Our brains are constrained, and those constrainments produce objects which are isomorphic to God, if you like, isomorphic to infinity. And there is a mathematical resonance between any two isomorphic objects. So there is a resonance between any subject and any other subject. And I think that in some ways is God. But the eschatology comes, and the sort of teleology comes, in that what I was referring to earlier, sort of clunkily, each subject is in a system. That system has a boundary. Those objects, those subjects within the system then can only have so many interactions before they saturate the relational vector space and become a secondary subject. This is why subject is progressive. And then that new bigger subject now sits in a constellation of other larger subjects, and they relate, and they have their own boundary, their own limit structure. And again, and each time this happens and happens and happens, you know, we end up with some potential, you know, absolute knowing, or Hegelian absolute, but maybe we don't. But, you know, Penrose, his cosmic cyclical cosmogony, or cosmology came up with the exact same thing, which was, hey, you know what? Just the relational dynamics of a pure entropic equilibrium, where everything is no longer relating to each other through zero relation, is geometrically isomorphic, topologically isomorphic to total congestion of relation. They both represent 0 degrees of relational freedom. Or sorry, they both represent zero relational, like the least possible relational interaction, least possible relation. And he suddenly was like, wait a minute, what if what's actually happening here is it's when everything entropically dissipates to 0 relation, essentially another big bang happens, those are the conditions for the production of a new universe. Very much like we thought, well, everything had to be completely congested. It's not so much everything has to be congested to 0 relation. It's just that everything has to be at 0 relation one way or the other. And then we get a new isomorphism to God. So I think that, this is why I was balky. Like, I like staying very mathematical and very dry, because I actually think it's the most transcendent way to get to a more religious, if you will, vision of metaphysics. Because implied in the dialectic, and this is why I don't like phenomenology of spirit, I don't like Hegel's more, poetic writings. And I don't like immediately talking about lack and desire and this and that and beauty and these sorts of things, and tackling those things. They're very chunky subjects that you can arrive at maybe simply by going to the fundamentals first. And I did have a talk with Jochen about beauty, and it's like, well, all these concepts, they are the sublated moments, Anyway, yeah, I guess that's my thing. I can't remember what you had posted, but it was something along the lines of, lack is constitutive of the subject. And to me, I would say, I guess, in summary, the subject really is an oscillation between lack and completion. And in my metaphysics, when the subject is in a state of lack, they are not a subject. They are by definition a system, because a subject is a saturated system. And when we desaturate, when we suddenly have an incursion of problematicity, and we're no longer in the saturated state of automaticity, phenomenologically speaking, we lose our subjectivity for a moment. We lose ourselves. And we have to either accommodate and incorporate and the object in question, the error in question, and resaturate into automaticity to regain our identities, or we don't, and we effectively go, nuts, and end up either psychotic or in a state of constant fear of that happening, which would be neurotic. So anyway. Yeah, that was my main sort of objection. It seems minimal, but to me, it's very fundamental division. When Zizek decides to interpret sublation as a genuine absence, just to accommodate the psychoanalytical presuppositions of the split subject, that's when his metaphysics becomes really, just for me, just ideological. It's like, yes, I'm confronting you with lack, but it's like, well, you're not looking at the entire picture of sublation. And because of that, as you said, you end up in a metaphysical dead end where lack is not generative, it's not creative, it doesn't precipitate the next hunt.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it just comes down to this, I think, as a disagreement, maybe, where I sort of like when you say that you prefer the mathematical kind of line of thought, because it sort of has like this more clean idea, like clean sort of trajectory for it. Um, I guess for me, like I just have a hard time accepting this system of we create a system and then a valence is imposed and then explains everything else. Because for me, it's like if I were to really incorporate yourself into the system, it's like your own value valence for mathematics is already a part of that system that delineates that system, right? Sort of paints the picture of that very system itself. And that's the part where I sort of struggle with, because for me the valence is really the kind of like the only starting point in which we even decide to do anything, talk about anything, metaphysics of anything.
Well, I think that, well, first of all, it's not quite mathematics that I would describe it as, more operational. So that I'm mostly interested in the operations, what they do. I think valence is, the way I'm using valence is not like that's exciting. Being excited or drawn towards something because I'm like, this could reveal something of the truth. That's sort of just having a resonance. Again, like, the way that I feel that happens metaphysically is that I have these, little balls of the real. I have these little balls of sublation in my sort of epistemic body. And if I feel a sudden resonance with another indeterminate interiority outside of me that exists, like, wait a minute, does that have this, is there a correspondence here? And then I'm drawn in. But there isn't, I wouldn't say that is a, and maybe I need to use another term, but that's not valence in the sense that I'm using it. Like if you feel something is the truth, I would say that's not a valence, because truth is referring to the indeterminate interiority of a thing in itself. So it's indeterminate. A valence is a determinate determination on a given interiority to exteriorize it. So a valence is like, well, this makes me sad, or I feel lack, or this is correct and that is wrong. That maybe I'd extend it that far, but I think emotion plays a role in valence, whereas excitement of correspondence precedes and is a sort of a higher order of adjudication than that. I do agree, obviously, I always want to include the subject and so on and so forth, and everything we do. But then I think we get into a state of relativism where nothing matters. So if it's a valence to think that something is saturated when it literally is saturated, then everything is a valence, in which case valence is rendered relatively, everything is just totally subjective and you can't come to any truths anyway. And it's a fairly nihilistic take.
Oh, well, and then I think I'll have to cut off, like, I'll give 10 more minutes, but I have to get back to my school stuff. But so yes, I 100% agree with you. If it's all valence, or then it's a nihilistic take. But this is sort of where, for me, like, proportionality really takes the center focus here, because even in Aristotle's kind of idea, because he actually even uses this term, and I don't know how it is in Greek, but in the translation, it is sort of like the thing to do is relative to your disposition, right? And even this whole, like, the more mystical take, right, of sort of like when they talk about vice, sort of like the way you see God is sort of relative to your disposition as well. So when it comes to answering this kind of relativism, kind of positionality argument, for me is that this is where like virtue for me is kind of like involved in my system precisely because of this. Because it would be, yes, everything begins as a valence. The question then becomes, is there really proof of us going beyond that? And for me, is that kind of lack, which indicates the proportionality in which you should be ascending towards something, right? And this is where beauty again gets at the centerfold of, because if, and I actually, to be honest, I actually think when most people talk about incompleteness, they don't even look at it as a lack. They will usually say it's nothing. They usually even think of missing something as a nothing, versus lack being the sort of, because I think what gets confused is like when we talk about lack, we know lack is not nothing, so we kind of ingrain that automatically. But I would actually say for a lot of people, nothing is the valence in which people cover over lack, and they try to stuff it to make it complete. And so that explains the sort of oscillation between nothing and something, and what we're calling incompleteness and whatever. But it's the fact that lack is already that ground in which you are repetitively trying to stuff it back into completeness.
Well, I mean, but not necessarily. I think that that's demonstrable with, you know, if you, I don't know, whatever, like, let's just say you're on a roll philosophically, you're learning like crazy, you're at school, you are just crushing it. At first you feel some kind of imposter syndrome, but then you get on some kind of, you get in the zone and you are just consuming information. You are crushing your essays. Is that lack? Or is that the propulsion and the inertia of excess? Because I don't think that all knowledge acquisition, all drive can be summed up to lack. I think instead we have to think of the excess product of saturation as itself a propulsive force. Yes, we can be hungry and need to go out to eat, but we can also eat so much that we can't stop eating. And the idea that that is driven from some lack, of course, is like, you know, a popular thing. I don't love myself and so on. But there is an inertia and excess to libido, which self-propels. And then, you know, anyway, if we wanted to get into just full on, you know, structuralism, the very presence of a lack in my mind. Oh, I miss food. I want French fries. I want French fries. I want French fries. Is that lack? Semantically, that's excess. It's excess thought of a thing you don't have. So either way, it's playing some constitutive role in lack. But last thing I'll just say is when we think of the child, and just to refer to this, you know, this oscillation again, and the baby in the womb, and let's just say they're fully, you know, they're at one. There is no exteriority. There is no lack. There is no sort of divide. Drive hasn't instantiated itself yet. And then they're born and they cry, and then they experience otherness, and then their lack, the fundamental lack, is wanting to regain oneness. Throughout our lives, we do regain oneness. And I think this is my big complaint with the language of Lacan and Zizek, is their impossible completion. Well, no, it's not. It's successive completion. And how can we ignore that? And then that's to say that there's some metaphysical desire that never gets quenched, which is a return to what? And they never explain themselves really. What, a return to the womb, sure, but like, yeah, we do return to the womb constantly. We can. It's simply that then we reinterpret that return as absence. So that's the main point I just wanted to hammer home. But Yeah, I know you got to go. It was a lovely talk on lack, and maybe to be continued on Daniel Garner's thing, because for some reason
Mhm.
people love, and I really think it's a fetishization of lack because it's so confrontational. There's something sort of like, racy about it. And of course, Zizek, that appeals to Zizek, and it appealed to me and Cadell and Gardner and Tim when we were doing our thing on lack. And anyone who's a follower of Zizek, as of course Cadell is, they're still very much focused on this idea of lack and the split subject and totally constitutive. But it seems more a function of psychoanalytic expediency than it does a fundamental truth of metaphysics, and that's the part I take issue with.
Okay. Just one last thing on, so, because this is where, because I know you kind of answered the God thing, but the next question would be, is there a sense in which your system is almost like a kind of like you're always sort of becoming God, not God
Yeah,
thing? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Like there is no, because I think this is where like the whole beauty and the goodness collapse for you, right? Where it's like a sublimated moment and then it collapses into goodness.
Well, goodness, I think if I'm not mistaken, yeah, we went off on beauty and the truth and good, but if I'm not mistaken, beauty would be the interiority, the indeterminate interiority of the subject. Goodness would be the sort of vectorial representation in almost two-dimensional form, the projection of those vectors. You can't access the vectors and the nuance of themselves, but they're represented on the surface of the subject as, let's say, good. But yeah, they don't collapse so much as they represent two different sides of the same coin: interior, exteriority, beauty, good.
Okay. Well, yeah, we'll probably have some more to talk about, but
Yeah,
this
man.
is good.
I love linking up. It's nice. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and then like the question that's still up in suspense is, thinking about how to relate the memory emergence without physical presence.
Yeah, I mean, I love your very simple thing of sitting there, and then you think of your father, like, and let's say your father's or whoever you think of is deceased. How does that occur? And why?
Mhm.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good.
All right, bro.
All right, let me finish this recording here.
Cool.